welcome to a deep dive into a side of climate change
Oh, yeah.
that we don't always talk about, the mental and emotional toll it takes. We've got a really interesting mix of sources for you today.
Okay.
Academic papers, news articles, even a few excerpts from a book.
Cool.
To give us a broad perspective, our mission, to uncover
Yeah.
those hidden costs of climate change.
Yeah.
The ones that don't show up in economic reports, but weigh heavily on individuals and communities.
It's fascinating how we often frame climate change in terms of dollars and cents, rebuilding costs after a flood, impact on agriculture. But these sources really highlight that there are deeper intangible losses that are much harder to quantify.
The Yale Environment Review piece, for
Right.
example, argues that fixating on the economic costs makes us miss the profound sense of loss. People experience the kind that shakes you to your core. What really resonated with me were the examples they gave, like the flood victims in the UK who lost their homes, and described it the loss of identity. It wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about a connection to their past, their community, their sense of self.
Exactly. And that sense of loss isn't confined to material things. The article also highlights the spiritual disruption felt by indigenous communities in Peru because of melting glaciers. It's not just about water resources, it's about the erosion of a sacred connection to the natural world.
It makes you realize that climate change impacts us on a far deeper level than we might initially think. It's like it disrupts our relationship with the earth, creating this unease, a sense of displacement.
Yeah.
And this is where these new psychoterratic syndromes come in. That term from one of the academic papers
Okay.
really struck me. It refers to the mental distress that stems from a damaged relationship with the earth. It's like this feeling of rupture in our sense of belonging.
And the paper goes on to outline various terms for understanding these psychological responses to environmental change. Terms you might have already heard, like eco-anxiety, ecological grief, and solastalgia.
You know, I think a lot of our listeners can relate to the idea of eco-anxiety.
Right.
That feeling of dread about the future, the uncertainty of what climate change will bring. But ecological grief, that's a bit different, isn't it?
It is. While eco-anxiety is future-oriented, ecological grief is rooted in the past. It's about mourning what we've already lost. Species, ecosystems, even familiar landscapes.
Makes me think of those times you return to a favorite childhood spot only to find it changed, almost unrecognizable.
Yeah.
That sense of displacement,
Right.
that solastalgia. Right. And according to our sources, it's becoming more common as climate change alters the landscapes we know and love.
That's right. What makes solastalgia so powerful is that it's not an abstract fear or a distant mourning. It's the distress you experience when your own home, your own place in the world is being transformed by these forces.
Wow.
You're still home, but your home has become unfamiliar.
It's like a homesickness, but you're still at home.
Yeah.
It's a really unsettling feeling. And this academic paper goes beyond just naming these syndromes. It maps out a whole spectrum of climate-related mental states.
Yes, and it's important to remember that not all of this distress is inherently negative or pathological.
No.
The paper actually highlights how these feelings can be catalysts for action.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Mm.
The distress can be paralyzing, but it can also be a powerful motivator to fight for change. But wouldn't you say that this burden of distress isn't evenly distributed?
Absolutely. That's one of the crucial points raised by both the academic paper and the Milbank Quarterly opinion piece, the unequal burden of climate change on mental health.
For example, they talk about children facing a lifetime of extreme weather events and uncertainty, growing up with a sense that their future is slipping away.
Right.
That must be incredibly heavy for young people to carry.
And it's not just children. The sources also highlight the plight of indigenous communities who often have a deep cultural and spiritual connection to the land.
Right.
Climate change for them means not just environmental change, but a loss of identity and traditional knowledge.
It's heartbreaking to think about. And we can't forget about the scientists who are on the front lines of this crisis.
Oh, for sure.
Witnessing firsthand the destruction of the planet, seeing the world in action, it takes a toll. The paper mentions burnout, depression, even a sense of trauma among scientists working in this field. They're bearing the weight of the world on their shoulders.
Okay. And that's where the Milbank piece raises an important critique. It argues that using these universal terms like eco-grief can actually mask the very real inequalities at play. It risks homogenizing the experience of climate change when the impacts are deeply uneven.
Yeah.
It's like saying everyone is equally vulnerable to a flood when we know that certain communities, often those already facing social and economic marginalization, are going to be hit the hardest.
So it becomes a justice issue as much as an environmental issue, right?
Precisely. We need to understand the social and political dimensions of climate change and its mental health impacts. It's not just about individual resilience, it's about recognizing the systemic factors that create and exacerbate these vulnerabilities.
So given this heavy reality, the uneven burden of climate change, what can we even do? Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
This is where our deep dive gets really interesting because the sources offer some interesting and sometimes surprising perspectives on solutions and coping mechanisms.
You're right. Where do we go from here? It's easy to feel overwhelmed, like we're up against these massive forces and our individual efforts are just a drop in the bucket.
It's like, do we need to completely overhaul the system to find any relief? Or will it take widespread distress to even start that change? It feels like a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah, it's a valid concern.
Yeah.
But one thing that stood out to me from the Milbank Quarterly piece is their emphasis on community-based organizations. They argue that these groups can play a crucial role in fostering both individual and collective resilience.
Like those mutual aid networks that sprung up after Hurricane Harvey.
Right.
They provided essential support, food, shelter, medical care. When government agencies were struggling to keep up, people taking matters into their own hands, not waiting for someone else to fix things.
Exactly. And that kind of initiative, that feeling of agency when people work together towards a common goal, it can be incredibly empowering. It shifts the narrative from I'm just one person, what difference can I make, to we can do this together.
So it's not just about big systemic change, it's about finding ways to act within our own communities, building that sense of collective power. But what does that actually look like on a day-to-day basis? Is it all about protests and marches, or are there other ways to engage?
Well, those are certainly important avenues for raising awareness and demanding change. But the academic paper we looked at suggests that even individual actions, seemingly small choices we make in our daily lives, can be influenced by these feelings of eco-anxiety and grief.
You mean like that little pang of guilt when you forget your reusable bag at the grocery store?
Mm-hmm.
Or the feeling of satisfaction when you make the effort to compost?
Precisely. Those actions might seem insignificant on their own, but when you multiply them across individuals and communities, they start to add up. And don't underestimate the power of the ripple effect. When we see others taking action, it can inspire us to do the same.
So it's about creating a culture of sustainability, a shift in mindset that goes beyond just individual actions. But what about those larger systems? The corporations driving so much of the environmental damage. Can we really expect them to change their ways?
Yeah.
The book we're referencing paints a pretty bleak picture of these multis, as they call them, these entities that thrive on chaos and profit from suffering.
Right.
It's like their whole operating system is built on the premise of limitless growth. And often that growth comes at the expense of the planet and human well-being.
It's a valid point, but remember, the book also points out that these corporations, powerful as they may seem, ultimately depend on agreements between people. What if we changed those agreements? What if consumers started demanding more ethical and sustainable practices? What if employees refused to participate in activities that harm the environment?
It's like hitting them where it hurts their bottom line. If enough people vote with their wallets and demand accountability,
Yeah.
even the most powerful corporations are forced to listen.
Yeah.
But consumer power can only go so far, right?
Yeah.
Governments also have a huge role to play in regulating these corporations and holding them accountable.
Absolutely. And the Milbank Quarterly piece doesn't shy away from criticizing government inaction. They argue that policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, while a step in the right direction, still contain compromises that perpetuate the use of fossil fuels. It's like we're asking individuals to be resilient in the face of a crisis that's being fueled by these powerful entities.
Yeah.
Shouldn't governments be doing more to protect their citizens and create systems that prioritize well-being and sustainability?
You'd think so. It makes you wonder who these policies are really serving. And this brings us back to the importance of political engagement, right? Voting for leaders who champion environmental policies, advocating for stronger regulations, staying informed about the issues, it all matters.
It does. And don't forget the power of education and raising awareness. The more people understand the connection between climate change and mental health, the more likely they are to take action.
So it's not just about individual choices or collective movements. It's about this multi-pronged approach Consumers, governments, communities, all working together to create a more sustainable future. But given the scale of the problem, the power of these multis, the slow pace of political change, it's still hard not to feel overwhelmed.
It is a daunting challenge, but that's where we have to remember the power of community, the strength we find in collective action.
It's like even the act of engaging itself can be a form of healing, a way to move from despair to empowerment.
Hmm.
And it was interesting to see how much emphasis the sources placed on the importance of acknowledging and honoring the grief and anxiety we're feeling. It's not about suppressing those emotions. It's about allowing ourselves to feel them, process them, and use them as fuel for action.
I completely agree. We can't simply bypass the emotional and psychological toll of climate change. We need to create space for grief, for anger, for fear. These emotions, when channeled constructively, can be powerful motivators for change.
It's like our pain for the planet can actually become a source of strength. But let's be real, it's not always easy to stay engaged, especially when we're constantly bombarded with bad news. Burnout is a real risk.
It is, and that's why self-care is so crucial. We can't pour ourselves into this work if we're running on empty. It's about finding ways to nurture our own well-being, whether that's spending time in nature, connecting with loved ones, engaging in creative pursuits, whatever helps us to reconnect with ourselves and remember what we're fighting for.
And sometimes self-care means knowing when to step back, to take a break from the news cycle and simply breathe. We can't be effective advocates if we're constantly battling our own exhaustion.
It's about finding that balance between action and rest, between engaging with the world and nurturing our own inner landscape. Speaking of which, that article about the toxic dust hotspots around the Great Salt Lake
Right.
really brought home the urgency of the situation. Here we are talking about eco-anxiety and grief, and then there's this very real, very tangible threat to people's physical health looming over communities. It's a stark reminder that climate change isn't some distant threat, it's impacting people's lives right now.
It really underscores the interconnectedness of everything, doesn't it? We can't address climate change without addressing social justice, and we can't address mental health without considering the environmental factors that contribute to distress.
Exactly. We're dealing with a complex web of interconnected systems. And that realization, while daunting, is also where we can find hope.
Because it means that change in one area can ripple outward, creating positive change in other areas as well. But after everything we've discussed, the bleak outlook, the power of those multis, the slow pace of political change, uh, is there really hope? Can we actually turn things around?
That's the question that haunts us all, isn't it? And I think the answer lies in the very sources we've been discussing.
I mean, even amidst all the bleakness, there's something in these sources that gives you hope. What is it?
Well, the very fact that these issues are being researched, discussed, debated, it means people are paying attention. They're starting to grasp the interconnectedness of it all. How climate change impacts us on so many levels, not just environmentally, but psychologically, socially, even spiritually. That awareness is where change begins.
That's a good point. Awareness is the first step, but how do we translate that awareness into action? Especially when the challenges seem so massive.
Remember what we learned about collective action. The Milbank piece emphasized how powerful it can be when communities band together, supporting each other, demanding change, making more sustainable choices. That's where the real hope lies, in our collective capacity to care, to act, to create a more just and sustainable future.
It's like that saying, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. But sometimes it feels like those multis, those corporations, they're just too big, too powerful. Is it naive to think we can actually hold them accountable?
It might seem that way, but remember those corporations are made up of people too, and people can change. Consumers can make different choices. Employees can push for change from within. Investors can divest from harmful industries. There are many levers of power, and we need to use all of them.
It's like we have to become a collective David facing down a Goliath. It's daunting, but not impossible. And maybe that's the key takeaway from this deep dive, the understanding that while the situation is dire, it's not hopeless.
Exactly. We have agency, we have choices, and we have each other. We can't let the enormity of the challenge paralyze us. Yes, we need to grieve what we've lost and acknowledge the very real anxiety we feel about the future, but we also need to channel those emotions into constructive action.
Because ultimately, hope is not a passive feeling. It's an active choice. A choice to believe that change is possible, to act on that belief, and to support each other along the way. So to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, maybe even ignited your passion to get involved.
Because as we've learned, Every step we take, no matter how small, every thread we weave into this tapestry of change brings us closer to a future where both people and the planet can thrive.
Thanks for joining us. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are countless individuals and communities working toward a better future, and we encourage you to find your own way to get involved.